You kids are so funny with your yim yams and your pronouns and your avocados. I had one of you kids walk up to me on the street and you said, "Hey Joe, how come you didn't vote for the bill?" And I said, "You kids don't know the meaning of politics."
I can really hear the many flavors of resentment on your voice. It's beautiful.
Okay, anyway.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your NDA lawyer's favorite podcast.
It's Speech from the Throne,
episode 18.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more random children popping up, claiming to be the spawn of Elon Musk's bounteous loins. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob. The joke is really good. Hey, Jacob, what are we talking about today?
Well, Liam, I'd like to refocus our podcast on the January 6th investigation hosted by the U.S. Congress into one Donald Trump's activities, an attempted coup on January 6th, 2021. And the reason why I'd like to refocus our interest as a podcast on there is because I think that the American debate has really fallen apart. Right now, the debate seems to be whether or not Donald Trump is going to be prosecuted. Listening to this January 6th investigation, it seems plainly obvious this man wanted and planned to overthrow the elected government of the United States.
Yep.
And we have no idea what he was planning to do after that, but at the very least, he knew the violence was going to take place. He knew what he was doing. He was well organized, and he is at least somewhat responsible for the 5 people that died storming the U.S. Capitol. He was well aware that his actions were going to lead to violence, and he was coordinating with people that he knew were armed and had deadly intentions. So for me, the debate about whether or not he should be prosecuted is answered. He must be prosecuted. And now the question is, should he be put in prison for the rest of his life, or should he be executed? And now I know, the listeners are going to be like, holy shit, Jacob, what? You've really gone off the deep end. Executed. They can't do that. Now, of course, the United States is still one of the...
Draw and quarter him in the town square.
The U.S. is a country that is happily willing to execute, petty criminals all the time, so... We'll just set that aside, but let's pretend that the United States is still a civilized country that actually values the lives of its citizens. Let's pretend. I'd like to tell you the story of Mr. Anwar al-Awlaki, a man who did something very similar to what Donald Trump has done, but the only difference was he had the misfortune of being born brown. So Anwar al-Awlaki, he was an American-born Muslim, and he rose to prominence as an imam. And he started preaching all around the United States, the United Kingdom, all around the Middle East against the U.S. policy towards Muslims post 9/11. Totally understandable. But he definitely went off the deep end. He advocated violence towards the state, and he did associate with some Al-Qaeda members. Never was proven to have done anything himself, but he absolutely did advocate violence, just as Donald Trump did. But, again, U.S. citizen, he was using his First Amendment rights to the absolute limit, never, ever charged with any crimes in the United States. Didn't matter. In 2011, when him and his 16-year-old son were traveling in Yemen, Barack Obama ordered his killing by drone strike. Him and his 16-year-old son, both U.S. citizens, both born in the United States, killed without trial. And this is not the only time this has happened. At least 4 civilian U.S. citizens have been killed by drones. And in a 2021 report by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, that organization claimed the U.S. has killed between 900 to 2,200 civilians by drone strikes in the last decade. 283 to 454 of those were children.
Shocking.
All killed with drones, all without trial. If you are threatening the United States, and if you are a brown person, you're dead. You're dead. There's no trial. There's no second chance. You're gone. But if you're Donald Trump and you do exactly the same thing, if you threaten the United States, if you threaten violence, if you threaten to overthrow their democracy, not only is execution off the table for you entirely, no one in the United States is talking about that for Donald Trump. Not only is your life totally protected, but there's a chance that you might be reelected as president of that country. Legitimately reelected as president. That's the craziness. That you can do exactly what Donald Trump did, and if the only difference is your skin color is different, you're gone. You're gone. But if you're Donald Trump and you're white, you can succeed again. This is where we need to start re-examining the debate in the United States. Because I'm not in favor of anyone being executed. As I said, I think that's a really uncivilized, barbaric cultural practice, to quote another former disgraced leader of our country. I don't think that people should be executed for what they're doing. But I absolutely believe that leaders need to be held accountable for the gross misconduct they do in office. And Donald Trump, a man who tried to lead a rebellion to overthrow the legitimately elected government, is exactly the sort of case subject we need to be examining here. We cannot let people like that get away with illegal actions. We cannot allow politicians to completely ruin their countries, often against the laws that they themselves write, and then get to resign their office and then, work at a bank for making $5 million a year for the rest of their life. If people need to be thrown in jail for politicians to get the idea that it's not okay to break the laws that they write, they need to be thrown in jail. And that's the sort of policy discussion that we should be having right now in regards to the January 6th investigation. Not arguing about whether or not Donald Trump can run for office again. The question should be whether or not he's kept in jail for the rest of his life. That's where the debate needs to be focusing. So I'll pass it over to you now. Flesh out this idea of putting consequences for the actions of politicians when they're in office.
Well, I mean, you got to bring in the Canadian context, and you can't really compare the two the same way. You can compare the two in terms of leaders getting out of things without much or any consequences, and I will give you several examples. First is probably most recently the SNC-Lavalin incident. That was something that if any human being had tried to do, individual, would be blatantly corruption, fraud, because it's a government and because there are laws that allow for a limited granting of a DPA, like as per the government's choice. A corporation who, by all accounts, is grossly negligent, if not malicious, towards people in the world. It's bribed foreign entities. Its senior leadership has been swimming in corruption for years. It goes down to the site level. They'll have sites set up that don't have any work for months. Maybe, I understand if we have listeners in Quebec who are used to this sort of thing with SNC-Lavalin, but to the rest of Canadians, it's just absolutely unfathomable that we allow this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then our federal government tries to grant them a break and, moreover, tries to pressure our Attorney General into making the decision to give them a break. That is shocking to me.
Yeah.
It's shocking to me. Do I think they should be executed? Obviously not. Do I think there should have been some sort of criminal discussion and investigation and punishment? Yes. I think perhaps. I think it's important to highlight that this was just 2019. Let's go forward in time. COVID. The response to COVID varied largely depending on what province you were in and what kind of government they led. I'm not by any means suggesting that there weren't premiers that didn't do a half-decent job with things or weren't trying their best, but there are certainly some premiers who should be facing criminal investigations right now. That includes Premier Jason Kenney. We've talked before on the show about how he was caught in between two sort of factions in his party, but you have to realize Jason Kenney is an ideologue at his heart. And he is in a province that is quite libertarian.
Yep.
It's quite based on the belief in individual liberty at all cost. And I think that reflected in his decision-making, which was to not really make any decisions in terms of health restrictions until it was way too late, because he refused to make those moves for so long. I do think it's not harsh to say that he has blood on his hands, that more people died than was not only what was predicted, but then could have been saved. It's absolutely ridiculous. And he's going to retire into a cushy private sector job. He's going to make six figures or millions for the rest of his life and retire cozily with no consequences. And then if you want to go back even further, you could look to past examples of Mackenzie King is one that comes to mind, and his persecution of Japanese Canadians, which was state sanctioned at the time.
Preventing Jewish refugees from coming to Canada. Turning away. Like, he was a racist, and I know that was normal at the time, but let's not forget that when Mackenzie King left office, it was 1948, I believe, 48,
And that was only 10 to 15 years out from Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights. And that's several years, but not that many years. It's already been over 20 years since 9/11, just to give you some perspective. So if you were in 1962 and looked at the Bill of Rights and looked back objectively on Mackenzie King as prime minister, you'd go, that guy was a racist. And I know that racism was more common and people were more blind to their privilege, but my gosh, like persecuting an entire people, we look over at China who's doing that right now and everybody's disgusted. But people still talk about Mackenzie King as this nation builder because he was in for so long. And I think in some ways he was a nation builder because he was in for so long, but he also did some terrible things. And, like I could go back. I mean, you'll definitely find more examples that are harsher as we go back into our history, but there are recent ones where there should have been criminal charges. I think another glaring one is the sponsorship scandal. The list goes on.
Or Brian Mulrooney, who is
Brian Mulrooney and Karl-Heinz Schreiber. Yeah. Like it goes on and on and on. For those of you who don't know, Brian Mulrooney and Karl-Heinz Schreiber, they were awfully close buddies, and it was never proven, I guess, but it's pretty kind of like an open secret that he
painfully obvious
was bribed. Yeah. Mulrooney was bribed by this Karl-Heinz Schreiber guy, and so it's like all these guys are just getting away with this. They're just getting away with this, and they're not only getting away with it and living a modest life and whatever. They're getting away with it, and they're making speeches, and they're doing book tours, and they're doing the talk show circuits, and they're getting the media also rehabilitates them too. Like after somebody left office, it seems like everybody forgets what they've done, and they start interviewing them in a positive light for no reason. Some things you do are unforgivable. You don't keep one of your promises, maybe that's possibly forgivable. If you don't admit to the fact that your administration was responsible for killing innocent civilians, including some of your own citizens, and you don't face any consequences for that to me is kind of unforgivable. I'll stop there. I'll let you jump in again. But those are my thoughts.
I'll bring up the counter arguments, because the reason why in Western democracies we're always hesitant to prosecute former leaders for their crimes that they've committed in office is because we worry that this tool, once we bring it out of the bag, is going to be used politically. That essentially, when one prime minister is removed, the next prime minister is going to make everything that guy did retroactively illegal, and then go after him as a way of destroying the political opposition. And there are lots of legal and political scholars that were writing in the time of the Great Enlightenment and the 1600s, the 1700s, the time period in Western Europe that sort of brought about our modern democracies, that really explicitly wrote against this idea, that there should be no political interference in the prosecution of our laws. The problem with this is that these scholars, these people that framed our constitutions and have really set the standards for how we gauge democratic conduct, had very different social mores than we have today. And they envisioned a completely different ideal state than what we currently live in. These theorists from the 1600s and the 1700s, they lived in a world where it was impossible for a leader, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, to truly separate themselves from the people. That there was always going to be, whether it's your servants or your peasants, there's always people living around the leader in close proximity that the leader was a little bit afraid of. And where there was common values, even in these huge communities. They never imagined a country like the United States of 300 million people. I mean, this is a time when Europe, there's countries of 10,000 people. They never imagined a country of 300 million people with a hugely effective security state, hugely effective military, where the leaders can basically do whatever the fuck they want to the population and never face consequences from it. So when these theorists are talking about we should never prosecute leaders, they're imagining a world where leaders are always going to rein themselves in, where leaders are going to check themselves. I mean, like in 1672, crowds of angry protesters literally cannibalized the Dutch prime minister after the collapse of the tulip market. That was how bad things got. Everyone had this in the back of their minds. It doesn't happen nowadays. So if we're going to make a principled and effective political system where leaders are being held account for their actions, I don't want to go back to crowds cannibalizing prime ministers, but we at least need to start thinking about prosecutions of former leaders, because this idea of the community holding their leaders to account no longer works. Our communities are too large, they're too separated, and the security state that protects leaders is way too effective. There's no way that leaders are going to naturally be held accountable by their own angry communities. At this point, we need to use the tools of the state of law and order to go after politicians. And there are some countries that do this better than others. Like in Germany, they have a special task force that is specifically designed to protect democracy. And they have, in the past, prosecuted members of AfD, the far-right Alternative for Germany party, for encouraging violence, for anti-Semitic and other hateful rhetoric. This is something that can be done in a democracy, but we're too afraid to do it. We need to start using the tools that other Western democracies are using to protect themselves and implement them now. Because if we do not, our leaders are just going to continue to get more corrupt, more insulated, and the system's going to get worse until the point of absolute collapse. The only way that we can possibly protect this fragile and fraying political order that we have is by ensuring that the leaders who make the decisions feel the consequences of those decisions.
You know what kills me is when people are like, they serve their country. It's like, exactly, they serve their country. Like, the very reason that people will sometimes use to, like, justify not going after somebody who is a leader of a country is the exact reason that we should be treating them like anyone else, or if not even by a higher standard.
Yeah, exactly.
And it would go a long way to satisfying, I think, some of this societal angst that is sending people into forums full of racism and conspiracy theories because they want some reason to believe that these people are so corrupt other than they're just blatantly corrupt. They look for a reason because they just can't believe how corrupt some of these people are and get away with it. Like, no wonder people go after elites. There's a whole reason that, like, the people going after elites aren't crazy. It's the people who bring racism and conspiracy theories into it that are crazy. And the World Economic Forum, they're the crazy ones.
Yeah.
Like, all this unfounded, pseudo-legal, pseudo-scientific bullshit that I see former colleagues of mine from Carleton reporting on my Twitter feed. Because some of them write for Western publications now that are right-wing. It's like, what, seriously? Like, it's, and I'm not saying, like, there aren't right-wing publications that wouldn't agree. Like, certainly, like, I would say some populist conservatives would agree that there needs to be more punishment in that regard. But it's like almost when the idea is brought up, like, people's eyes glaze over because, you know, all they remember about Brian Mulroney is the duet with Reagan. Or, you know, when they think of Mackenzie King, they think of World War II instead of whatever. Like, so it's, I don't know. It's just, it's frustrating because I don't know if this is, politicians aren't going to prioritize punishing themselves.
No,
but it would sure go a long way to setting up some kind of accountability. And while they're at it, they could reform the criminal justice system. You know, there's all kinds of justice reform that they could meaningfully undertake if they felt like it, which they never do. I mean, obviously, you can't compare some of the more severe, like, American war crimes to, not to say that Canadians haven't committed war crimes, because we have, but I just mean, like, the sheer scale you can't quite compare. But you certainly can compare leaders getting off the hook with that, with impunity, you know, not getting punished for their actions. So.
Well, there's just like, if there are no consequences to your actions, there's absolutely no reason not to act poorly. And I do find it very strange when I've heard Bruce Anderson on Peter Mansbridge's podcast all the time is complaining, oh, you know, there's no one of any quality is interested in running for office, and it's so hard to run for office, and you're always going to be attacked, and the public's always criticizing you, and you always get hateful rhetoric. And this is all true. You know, nowadays it definitely is a hard job to be a politician.
Harder than, I would say, harder in terms of your physical safety. Like, I think that's
true.
getting a little heated.
Well, you know, so when I worked as chief of staff to the head of the Students' Union, Carleton, for residents, it was a tough job. There was always some crisis every day, and that was only a constituency of 3,900 students there. But there was always somehow some sort of scandal or some sort of mini story that had to be covered up. We were just going from urgency to urgency, always crisis communication mode. And everyone is always stressed out all the time. I'm not going to argue that being a politician is not difficult. If it was difficult for me and my team that only had to deal with 3,900 constituents, it's got to be really difficult for an MP that has to deal with 100,000 constituents. It's got to be really, really difficult to be the prime minister that has to deal with 34 million constituents. But the problem is that at the same time, There's huge rewards to being in power. You get to be able to make huge changes to the world. And so I don't doubt for a minute that it's really tough to occupy the post, but there are such privileges that come from it. There's never going to be a limit of people that want to have that job.
Yeah.
And so if people like Bruce Anderson are complaining that there's no one of good quality that's running for the office, it suggests to me that people of quality tend to not see the office as powerful as it is. The fact that people of quality are preferring to work in the private sector suggests to me that the private sector is making more important decisions than the prime minister, and they're making these decisions without any public interest. So that's really a democracy problem here. If we have a functioning democracy where our politicians are the ones calling the shots and not the corporations, there will never be a limit of people that want to take those jobs, which means we can have as strict standards as we want. We can have the strictest standards because there will be no limit of good, qualified people running for those posts. If we run into a limit of people that are trying to occupy public office, that's the clearest indication that a public office is not as powerful as it claims to be. And that's a bigger problem for our democracy.
To me, it all comes down to the kind of image that, not that you want to project, but the kind of image of like how you want to be remembered. Because obviously hindsight is always 20/20, and like we certainly do view ex-leaders through rose-colored glasses. But anybody who is actually interested in politics and who follows politics knows what you got up to. When people are reading the history books about you, do you want them to read that you killed how many hundred people with a drone? If, your decision on a COVID health policy, caused 4,000 more deaths or whatever than necessary? Like, I'm just throwing numbers out here, but like there are real figures of real deaths that could have been prevented. And I don't have them in front of me, but the point is that you don't want to be remembered for stuff like that. If you're truly getting into politics to do something and not just be something, which is another problem. People get in just to be something. If you get in to do something, you don't want people to read through your achievements and see that. You don't.
No.
You just don't want that on your record. And you want to be seen as somebody who maybe made mistakes. Like, I'm not saying that it's not okay to make mistakes. Like, my God, like, people make mistakes all the time. But, like, for God's sakes, show a little accountability and humility. Like, it goes a long way than pretending like you're this infallible bubble. And if you do something like awful, then, and criminal, then you should face responsibility for that. And too often these things go unpunished. And if it was, another citizen, any other citizen than somebody in office, then they would be punished.
And I do think that there is sort of still a cancer at the root of Western political theory, where we have not come to terms with the fact that the fascists lost World War II and that we need to be moving on. One of the major reasons why we don't want to prosecute leaders for the crimes that they do in office is because we still have this idea of the leader is the one that makes the exceptions. The leader has to be, in a certain sense, above the law, because you never know if there's going to be an emergency, if there's going to be some crisis. We want to make sure that the leader is acting decisively as possible and they don't feel circumscribed by the law. This is a common argument for why presidents and prime ministers should be exempted from the laws normally written. And the progenitor of that idea is a man named Carl Schmitt, a Nazi and like a literal card-carrying member of the Nazi party, but still a man who is taught as a prominent political philosopher to this day in all universities in the Western world. I had to learn about him as well in my public affairs and policy management classes. We have not excised these literal fascist thinkers from our philosophy and moved on, which is crazy to think about that. It's 80 years since the end of the Second World War, and we still have not internalized the lessons of that war. We still have not built a political philosophy that genuinely believes in the concept of democracy. I mean, it wasn't until the 1960s that we allowed everyone to participate, regardless of their gender and the color of their skin, in our political life. It wasn't until the 1960s that everyone past the age of 18 was able to vote. And it wasn't until very recently that we ended things like, residential schools and the elimination of entire races from the public. And we still don't seem to be able to realize a new idea of public participation, where leaders are held accountable for their actions and aren't just infallible king-like figures that get to decide whatever they want while we, the poor peasants, have to listen to them. We're still caught up in this weirdly medieval idea of what a king should be or what a leader should be. We declare that we're an equal state, we're a democratic state, but the philosophies, the laws that build our state don't really internalize this message.
Well, the reason that we haven't excised these philosophers from our textbooks is because
God.
No, I had to interject. No, I mean, I think you tapped on quite a few points there that are basically diagnosing Canadian smugness and Western smugness. You know, I think we put ourselves on a pedestal because we were minutely better than the Soviets in doing some things. You know, it's like, okay, now move on, evolve. And there's been really virtually none of that. We're still, you know, we're in the 21st century. We're 22 years into this, 21 technically years into this century. And we're still sitting here twiddling our thumbs. We're still driving cars everywhere, and mostly gas cars even. And we're still, Canada in particular, held hostage by the same three telecom companies, except if you're in Quebec or Saskatchewan, and that's it. That's it. Like we're just sitting here, nothing significantly changed, systemically speaking, really, since the 1980s.
Yep.
What are you gonna do? Like, are we just gonna sit idly by and have we turned into the conservatives? Like, has the left turned into the conservatives? Not in terms of like their ideological views, but like in terms of just being obsessed with just conserving a legacy and a status quo rather than building on it. Like, because it seems like the left has just hit the brakes and we're just spinning our wheels and we can't figure it out. Like, we're in both Canada and the United States, we're about to turn the country over to fascist sympathizers and in some cases fascists, because we have nothing valuable to add to the conversation other than enriching the position that the politicians find themselves in and throwing a few boutique tax cuts here and there and doing, you know, like, I don't know, it's like maybe that's not true. I'm sure people could bring up some great things that were done. I know there have been some good things that have been done over the past 7 years. I'm not saying it was a complete failure, but it's just so underwhelming from what we thought it would be. And obviously it's not just Justin Trudeau's fault, but he's certainly part of it. And he's just turned out to be another neoliberal in a long line of neoliberals since the 1980s that have just decided to do nothing significant.
Well, it's like, what are the incentive structures here? If you're in the United States particularly, and anytime you incite violence against liberals and the crowd cheers, and you're not held accountable for that, then of course you're going to be inciting violence against liberals at every opportunity, and you're going to use that to gain power. And, you know, one day, right now in Canada, you don't get cheers when you incite violence. Most of the time. Most of the time you don't get cheers. But there's going to be a time very soon where Pierre Poilievre is going to say something that could be interpreted as inciting violence against leftists. I mean, certainly a lot of the anti-trans rhetoric Dr. Jordan Peterson brought up a few years ago definitely was encroaching on the territory, and people are going to cheer on it. And once that happens, you know, once the crowd gets really worked up and there are no consequences for it, we're going to be past the twilight zone. And I come from the province of Alberta, where politicians for a long time have said some pretty horrible things. I mean, so I brought up my MLA, Ron Orr, before on the podcast. As a preacher, he would regularly say in his sermons that homosexuality should be a crime and homosexuals should be locked up. And there also were former candidates in his party that said worse things. It said homosexuals should be killed. No one was ever held accountable for these things. No one was ever held accountable because, you know, they're in public life, so anything they can say goes. Well, you know, he said those things, and he's still in the legislature. He was in Jason Kenney's cabinet. You know, so it's very clear that you don't get punished for saying unconscionable things. You get rewarded. So guess what? More people are going to say unconscionable things. And that's just going to normalize that sort of language. It's really dangerous. And if we don't draw a line in the sand now and clearly lay out what is and is not allowed in the public space, we're going to be in a real crisis. As I said, Germany has this. Germany, a country that has experienced the extremes of the political system and knows how to avoid approaching those extremes, has set up an office that is specifically designed to prosecute politicians that play footsie with the extremist side, that go too far against the norms of their democratic process. I don't understand why other Western democracies do not try to do the same thing. So if we don't hold our politicians to account, no one else will.
Yeah, and I think we're at a crossroads. I think it was earlier this week, Rachel Gilmore, she's a journalist for Global News. She is somebody who is frequently harassed on her Instagram, which is public. Because she's a journalist, she tries to keep it, there are some casual pictures on there, but tries to keep it professional, and professional photos, with the odd vacation photo, and just people commenting horrible things about her on these photos. It'll be the most innocent photo of her dog, and people will be saying horrible things about her and saying that you're a 10, but you're a lying media, you're the lying media. Or, you look like you give good top, and horrible things that you just don't say to somebody on the street, but you can say online because there's that anonymity to it. So she's getting harassed by email on the daily. And then when Poilievre made the decision to march with James Topp, who is currently a Canadian soldier who is protesting against vaccine mandates and trekked across the country to protest them, he's also been linked to right-wing groups. And of course, when a conservative, in past decades, when a leadership candidate would do something that shocking, you would ask them as a journalist, why did you do that? And it's not as if you're even saying, even though I think it is wrong, it's not even as if she said, why would you do this terrible, terrible thing? She said, what made you decide to associate with James Topp, given his association with far-right circles? And what do you have to say about his history of speaking about white supremacy? Can you denounce white supremacy? Just to, and I guess he took issue with that. So his campaign put out a letter, basically referring to her in all but name, published it on Twitter, saying that she's unprofessional and basically dragging her. And it prompted Laurie Goldstein of the Toronto Sun, of all people, to stand up for her, which Laurie Goldstein's one of the most painful people you'll ever read. Listeners, I'm not a fan. I'm biased, but anyway, he defended this Global News journalist, Rachel Gilmore, over this. He said shame. It wasn't. He added Pierre Poilievre, so he said something along the lines of be careful, Pierre Poilievre, of naming individual journalists. It might seem innocuous because it's just a tweet, but it just takes one disturbed person to hurt somebody, something along those lines. He stood up for her, which was really nice. But I was shocked. But this is what we're coming to. We're having journalists who normally would not run in the same circles at all, who fit on different sides of the spectrum, because yes, the media isn't a megaphone. There are different views in the media. He was sticking up for her because it is so shocking to see a political candidate in this country, particularly one that wants to be prime minister, and so much has gone out of his way to brand everything as wanting to be prime minister, doesn't want to be asked basic questions about who he chooses to associate with. Guess what? You're in public life. You're going to get asked about who you associate with for the rest of your life. And this is a fella who is fundraising off of targeting a journalist who everybody, it's an open secret, everybody who is on Twitter in the Canadian politics world knows that her and several others are being harassed on a daily basis by nut jobs. And Pierre Poilievre, who wants to be your prime minister, turned it into a fundraiser.
It's something that I missed in our episode on Patrick Brown's disqualifications, but it is remarkable that when the Conservative Party was choosing who to disqualify for leadership, they decided to go after Patrick Brown, which, reasonable. He's someone that seems quite obviously corrupt. But they were willing to keep on their ballot a man who regularly associates with white supremacists, who associated and defends quite publicly a group of extremists who occupied our capital city, and a group of whom tried to overthrow the elected government in Ottawa. They happily kept him on their ballot, Pierre Poilievre. So if we're talking about, a party trying to cleanse its image and the party trying to ensure that the people that are running to lead it are of a solid moral character, it's so bizarre to me that they would allow Pierre Poilievre to pass that process. And the fact that they are allowing it makes it pretty obvious to me why it was just a political exercise to kick out Brown and keep Pierre. If we're going to draw a line in the sand, the line has to be at Pierre Poilievre. There's no way that we in a normal country could accept a man that is so willing to toe the line with extremists as Pierre Poilievre is. And the fact that he is a stone's throw away from becoming leader, and once he becomes leader of the Conservative Party, just steps away from the Prime Minister's office, should shock everyone every day that they're listening to that news.
But here's the thing: is it's going to shock Canadians, but it doesn't shock politicos at all.
No,
we can't forget that Pierre Poilievre's campaign manager is his ex-girlfriend and Stephen Harper campaign manager Jenny Byrne, who is famous for her wonderful barbaric cultural practices tip line. Somehow, despite literally helping craft a policy that goes after brown people because they're brown people, she's been able to establish her own communications firm and work for another federal campaign with zero media scrutiny. She's still on national television. She's still on liberal podcasts as a regular. It's shocking to me that she even manages to get a platform at this point, given the architect of these two campaigns and what she's probably likely to pull in the general election. And again, we get back to the same theme of this episode. No punishment. No punishment.
Well, you have a guy like Barack Obama who killed thousands of people, hundreds of civilians, extrajudicially through drone strikes, prosecuted 2 wars, and still ends up with the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's no sense of justice
amongst the elite clique that get to make the vast majority of our political and economic decisions, because they're just rewarding each other for their own bad actions. If there's going to be some sort of consequences, it has to come from the public. It has to come from a prosecutorial system that is not politically influenced, which is why, as you said before, the SNC-Lavalin affair is so dangerous and so problematic. Is that it's our only legitimate option to give consequences to these leaders. And if our system of law and order breaks down, and if we're not able to use an independent prosecutor's office to hold these people to account, the only option we do have is publicly cannibalizing our leaders, is the rioting, is the revolution. And I don't think any of us want that sort of society.
No, we want to live in a civil society.
I don't think any of us want to live in that sort of violent, shitty place. We want to have a world where independent prosecutors can enforce the law that politicians who are duly elected by the public write. This is so simple. Why are we arguing for this? And why did we have to?
Because there's no incentive to get it done.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why we're spinning our wheels. Yeah. And on that note, Chipper as usual, hope you enjoyed the discussion this week, and look out in future weeks for our discussion with a Globe and Mail journalist. I won't say who yet, but we're going to be unpacking the Blake Lemoine podcast with a certain special guest in the coming weeks.
And stick around to the end of this episode where you'll hear a preview of that conversation that Liam and I had with Blake Lemoine.
And as usual, if you have any comments or questions or whatever, just email us at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. All one word, lowercase, easy. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
This is the first contact with an alien mind.
According to Google, Lambda, a speech predicting software, is nothing more than an incredibly advanced neural network, a chatbot. The software engineer Google itself hired to investigate Lambda for bias, however, now thinks it's much, much more. Lambda is sort of the first step in that. It's something that's so human. And so, do you think it's a...
Definitely not. It's at least step 7 or 8.
In June of this year, Blake Lemoine sought to change the world with his claims that Lambda, the most sophisticated AI system ever created, had become sentient. This week, on Speech from the Throne, we'll ask the man himself what this first contact really means. We'll talk Google's dirty practices.
Google runs thousands of psychological experiments on billions of humans every day.
Public apathy.
I think people freely gave portions of their will away because they didn't feel like making the decisions for themselves.
And the greatest villains of our age.
That actually reminds me of a line from a sci-fi movie. I'm not going to try to quote it, but it was said by Anakin Skywalker.
Friend of the pod. Join me, Jacob Kenny, and co-host Liam McPherson as we pick the brain of Big Tech's canary in the coal mine. Only on Speech from the Throne.